I think we'll get started here. Thanks to everybody for joining in to, excuse me, this webinar on Monday. I hope you're having a slightly better day than I am. I managed to dock my coffee all over my desk and myself and everything just a few minutes before the webinar. And I was chalking it up to working from home, but then I realized I could be clueless and uncoordinated regardless of my work location. So that didn't really help. But we're going to start into the webinar right away. I'm going to start by giving you obviously the topic and introduction, private land conservation, and the pathway to Canada Target 1. I'm going to go through a bunch of stuff. I'll describe the outline in a second. Introduce myself. My name is Guy Greenaway. I'm a senior project manager here at Miistakis. And just to get started with everything here, I'm going to just check the technology. Hang on just a second. There we go. Okay. For everybody who's going to be involved in this webinar, I just want to let you know that you're muted by default, so don't worry about that. You can talk or eat chips in the background. We're going to use the chat box for questions. So if you haven't brought that up yet, find that. It's on that navigation bar, and then you can enter your questions. What we'll do is you can enter those as we're going along, and at the end, what I'm going to do is I will take the questions that I see in that box, go through them in order, and answer them all at the end. So don't hold off. Enter those questions as you want. One thing to do is make sure that you've checked to say to all panelists and attendees to make sure that the messages go to everybody and everybody can see them. So I'm just going to ask if a couple of people can give me a thumbs up if the sound is okay, if the audio for me is coming in all right. Okay, great. Thank you. All right, well, let's get started. So to begin with, for those of you who don't know the Miistakis Institute, we're a not-for-profit registered charity and applied research institute. We're affiliated with Mount Royal University in Calgary, and that's where we're located. And our goal, our vision is a world where communities have genuine access to the science and research they need to make choices that promote healthy landscapes. And the work that we do is to try and make that innovative research that's being done by us or by others accessible to communities and decision makers, truly accessible, meaning not just send them a document, but put it in a form they can use. And decision makers are everybody from that landowner to a provincial government agency, federal government, industry, other NGOs, whomever is making a decision that has an impact on the health of the landscape. So today what I'm going to do is I've got a fairly packed webinar here, but I'm going to go through all of this information in hopefully enough detail, but not too much detail that you get the gist of this. I'm going to start off by giving you the context on the 17% target. I'm going to talk a little bit about PAs and OECMs and try and use as many acronyms as possible to confuse you. PAs are protected areas, OECMs are other effective area-based conservation measures, a term only a bureaucrat or academic could love. Then I'm going to talk about the pathway to Canada Target 1, the structure, and then I'm going to dive in a fair amount of detail into, well, a reasonable amount of detail into what's called CPCAD, the Canadian Protected and Conserved Areas Database, basically the national database of protected and conserved areas. And understanding that structure is going to help lead us into the next part, the challenges for private land conservation, because that's really what this presentation is about, is helping you understand what those challenges are. And not to leave on a low note, I'm going to go from there into what I think are some potential solutions to help us get through those challenges. And then I'll leave you with a final thought, just something to chew on for the rest of the week. So the 17% target. The key context here, this is an effort to protect 17% of our terrestrial lands and inland waters. Sorry, just got a little bit of a tech issue here I got to get dealt with. And to note that it really is an arbitrary number, and that's okay. It's intended to be a catalyst for long valued efforts, things that we wanted to do for a really long time in terms of increasing the area of protection across the country. But it does create some challenges, and it does create some opportunities for private land conservation. But understanding that context as the starting point is important. That all came from the Convention on Biological Diversity. So the vision in the Convention on Biological Diversity included this piece. It said, by 2050, our vision is that biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people. That's in the strategic plan for biodiversity, and that's where the Aichi targets come from, and many of you may have heard of these targets. Aichi target 11 is probably the one that's most talked about. That's where we get the 17% from. So it said by 2020, at least 17% of terrestrial and inland waters and 10% of coastal and marine areas, especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services, are conserved through effectively and equitably managed, ecologically representative, and well-connected systems of protected areas. And this is where we first got this term, and other effective area-based conservation measures, and integrated into the wider landscapes and seascapes. And I just want to point out here, you note that there are no caps on other effective area-based conservation measures. It wasn't intended to be a thing, a designation. It was just a recognition that the ways that we can do this will include protected areas, which is one area-based conservation measure approach, but there are other effective area-based conservation measures. So in trying to understand that, sometimes we kind of get caught up in that. So the key points here are 17% of terrestrial and inland waters, important for biodiversity and ecosystem services, effective, equitable, representative, connected, protected areas, and OECMs integrated into the wider landscape. So what Canada did, like all other countries, they took those international targets and they adapted them for their own country. So Canada, we adapted this to say, by 2020, at least 17% of terrestrial areas and inland water and 10% of coastal and marine areas are conserved through networks of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. So I'm going through all of the details of these definitions for a reason. When we compare that to the initial target, both of them say 17% of terrestrial and inland. Ours says areas of importance for biodiversity, but we've cut out the ecosystem services part. We cut out the effective, equitable, representative, connected system. Protected areas and OECMs are both included in there, and we cut out the integrated into the wider landscape. So we've sort of trimmed that down, and I think it's important to keep that in mind because some of the things that were intended with this whole initiative kind of get lost when we start talking in very, very strict terms only about 17% for certain reasons, certain areas. So the goal of the Convention for Biological Diversity, Target 11, is improve the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. And by contrast, the goal for Canada Target 1 is, by 2020, Canada's lands and waters are planned and managed using the ecosystem approach to support biodiversity conservation outcomes at local, regional, and national scales. So the thing to note about these two goals is that the Convention on Biological Diversity emphasizes biodiversity as the reason behind that goal. And our goal in Canada emphasizes the management aspects. It's that these lands and waters are planned and managed. So again, we're taking a slightly different approach, and that's reflected all the way down through all of the plans and the initiatives and the goals. This is something that I think is also really important to note. So this was a group of people from the Canadian Council on Ecological Areas who, when this first came out, were really concerned about what was happening here. So they noted in a paper that they had published in a peer-reviewed journal, Aichi Biodiversity Target 11 contained a significant policy reporting challenge, conceding that both protected areas and other area-based conservation measures could be used to meet the national targets. And I think it's really important to note this language, that it's a significant policy and reporting challenge, and there's a concession made that OECMs could be used. So right away, there was not a view of this as an opportunity, but a view of this as something that we're gonna have to get past, something that we're gonna have to watch. Okay, PAs and OECMs, protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. Luckily, I will not be going through all of the detailed IUCN definitions and going through point by point, but a lot of this research and the work that we did was based on doing that. And it's important to do that. This comes from an internationally accepted set of standards. So it didn't just get invented for this process. The basic distinction here is that protected areas are areas with a protective mechanism, and the primary goal, the primary management goal, is biodiversity conservation. In the case of other effective area-based conservation measures, these are areas that also have a protective mechanism, but the primary goal is not biodiversity conservation. That might be a secondary goal, or it might not even be a goal, but the resulting protective mechanism results in there being biodiversity conservation. So that's the key distinction between these two. So If you wanted to think about this in a private land conservation context, we could look at conservation easements. And in our legislation in Alberta, we can have conservation easements for three essentially different purposes: biodiversity and environment, cultural scenic purposes, agricultural purposes. The reality is, when you're looking at any given conservation easement, they're probably a combination of all three or a combination of a couple of them. There isn't really a tendency to just have a single consideration within a conservation easement. So when we look at the OECM protected area kind of designation, logically what we would tend to see is that the conservation easements that are focused exclusively on biodiversity might be considered a protected area. The conservation easements that have these mix of goals, or maybe don't have a biodiversity goal, but end up with that overlap anyways, might be considered other effective area-based conservation measures. But if it's something that's just in the agriculture or just in the cultural scenic, it would not be considered an OECM or other effective area-based conservation measure or protected area, because it doesn't have biodiversity in there as a goal at all. So another way we can think about this is public land, private land, and how this might play out on both of those. So if we consider the land base to be lovely and square and even, there are areas that are private land, areas that are public land. And in both cases, we have areas within those landscapes that are biodiverse, that have something that we may want to protect or conserve. So protective mechanisms, protective designations have to be there in either the case of a protected area or an OECM. If you don't have that protective designation, it may be biodiverse, but that doesn't mean anything in the context of this kind of counting or accounting of protection. So it's diverse, but it doesn't have any certainty or guarantees that it's going to stay that way. So if you have a protected area within a biodiverse private landscape, or a protected area within a biodiverse public landscape, and in both cases they have conservation, biodiversity conservation as a primary goal, those are protected areas. In the case where conservation is a secondary goal, then those would be OECMs. And in the case where we're on those areas, but there is no protective mechanism, then it's neither. And the same thing applies in areas where it's not biodiverse, no protective mechanism. You wouldn't include those in any way. So that's kind of the way that theoretically, conceptually, it's supposed to play out. So we have the classic philosophical question of, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? It kind of relates to that. If a tree provides biodiversity in the forest and there's no one there to say it's a protected area, does it still conserve biodiversity? And joking aside, this is the challenge that we have with a lot of privately protected areas and OECMs, both public and private, is the difference between the designation and somebody saying there's a designation and whether or not that management regime and the protective mechanisms actually in fact conserve biodiversity. So I mentioned briefly privately protected and conserved areas, and I'll just note the term conserved areas is increasingly, and this is coming from the IUCN all the way down, is increasingly used to refer to OECMs. So rather than have that big long acronym, that big long name, increasingly we're using conserved areas to represent that. So we have private protected areas and private conserved areas, or private OECMs. And what are they? They're the same as public protected areas and OECMs. It's just a difference in the governance. So it's under private governance. And private governance can be a number of different things: individuals and groups of individuals, non-government organizations, for-profit owners, research entities like universities, religious entities. All of those are included, again, all the way from the World Database on protected areas, IUCN, all the way down to Canada's distinctions. And in fact, when you look at that World Database on protected areas, obviously government governance is the most frequent governance type, but private ones are in there quite a bit, 13,000 of them across the world. So it's not like we're creating something new. We're not starting with something that has never existed before in the database. Okay, let's look to Pathway to Canada Target 1. So the structure here is important to understand. So initially it was set up with Alberta and the federal environment ministers as the co-chairs, coming together to create this national initiative. There was a national advisory panel, essentially a citizen or expert citizen panel that created background report, and then the national steering committee was struck from the agencies across the country, all of the different governments across the country, and that National Steering Committee has led the activity since then. There are a number of expert task teams that have been created, sometimes ad hoc and created to address a particular area, create a discussion paper, including one on OECMs, one on connectivity, one on representation. And those have done their work, reported back to the National Steering Committee, and it's moved on. But it's important to note that this is federal, provincial, and territorial parks agencies. So it's made up of people from those agencies from that perspective. One of the terms that gets used repeatedly, and frankly a little bit loosely, is the term jurisdiction. So the first thing to remember is that this is not a federal initiative, this is a national initiative. It is all across the country, and it's all entities pulling together, and there's some coordination provided and funding provided by different governments, but it's fundamentally a national initiative. And the terminology that they use is, each jurisdiction reports on the sites under its administrative control. And then most of the documents afterwards all refer to the jurisdictions will do this, the jurisdictions will do that. But in CPCAD, the database, and in the strategic plans and the initiatives of the National Steering Committee, they constantly refer to these jurisdictions and then say a jurisdiction may report protected or conserved areas not under their direct control if, quote, the jurisdiction has assumed the responsibility for the recognition and reporting of these areas on behalf of regional governments, Indigenous groups, or private property organizations. So what's interesting is the Indigenous groups were asked specifically, an entire mechanism was created, the Indigenous Circle of Experts was created, and an entire process for them creating the Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas mechanism that would then report back. That was not the case for municipalities, although they did have an opportunity to provide recommendations, and there was no consultation with private property organizations, land trusts, universities, corporations. You don't get asked, the provinces do it for you. They report as the jurisdiction for you. The current status, Alberta has actually stepped down as the co-chair now. I won't go into detail about that, but it essentially stems from the change from the 17% target for 2020, moving on to the 25% target by 2025 and 30% target by 2030. There was some significant concern on the part of the government of Alberta, and so they didn't feel it was appropriate to continue in that co-chair role. Right now, the National Steering Committee is working through the practicalities of identifying OECM. So we've got the theory behind it, but what does that actually mean? They're actually doing a strategic analysis on that 25% target. What does that actually look like? Driven by the fact that as of spring 2019, nationally, we're at 11.8%. In Alberta, we're just a little over 15%. That means we have to add 13%. We have to add more than we currently have by 2025 to meet that target. The expert task teams are still working at different components and different pieces, and they're still continuing to look to, again, the jurisdictions for the data to update the new database, which I'm going to talk to you about in detail. So the new database is it's called CPCAD, the Canadian Protected and Conserved Areas Database. And it's the primary mechanism for collecting the information for accounting. And then all of that goes up to the international level. It goes across as the national level. So we use this as a measure. How are we doing for protecting our land base? So just some of the origins, because this is really important. It started off that we had the Conserved Areas Reporting and Tracking System, or CARTS. This was created by the Canadian Council on Ecological Areas. And the Canadian Council on Ecological Areas is a collection of really committed and really clever and really great people who had come together to try and create some sort of mechanism for keeping track of what we had protected. And they worked in conjunction with Environment and Climate Change Canada on doing that. They also created some screening tools that they used both as CARTs and now have transferred into the CPCAD process. All of that got rolled into the CPCAD, the Canadian Protected and Conserved Areas Database, and that has moved now primarily to the management of Environment and Climate Change Canada, although they're still working with a lot of the folks from the CCEA. In fact, the expert team on this is essentially that same group from the Canadian Council on Ecological Areas. There continues to be regular calls for data. usually on a quarterly basis, to update the data that's in the current database and collect it in a certain way that fits into the database. The protected areas agencies in each province and territory are the ones that the database managers will go to get the data. And so there is no independent reporting of data for private land conservation. All of that goes through the provincial agency. And again, except for Indigenous protected and conserved areas who have their own process, and that goes in a separate way. Okay, so hang on. I'm taking you into the national database schema, meaning the fields and what all of this looks like. I've trimmed it down and tried to simplify it, but it's really important to understand the structure, because we use this as the foundational mechanism for gathering this information, sharing this information, and tracking what we're doing. If you don't understand what's in that database, then you don't understand what comes out of that database or what numbers come out of that database. So here's the field list. I've listed them all here. You don't need to look at this in any detail right now. It's actually a longer list than this because most of them have a French and an English component to it. But what I've done is I've taken all of those fields and I've kind of organized them for you. So there's really sort of 4 categories of these fields. The descriptive ones, so the name, official area, as in how many hectares is in this protected or conserved area, and the location, which really just boils down to the province or the territory. There's administrative information, so the parent identification number and zone. Some of these areas are separated into zones, so you have to identify each individual zone, and then collectively you call that the parent. The reporting jurisdiction identification number, type designation, status, protection date, delisted date, ownership, general comments, and internet link. Some of those are a little bit unclear, and I'm going to talk about the ones that are unclear. Some of them are pretty straightforward. And then the next section is the ones that speak to the protective mechanism and the governance. So there's the IUCN Target 11 and Canada Target 1, IUCN Management Category, OECM, Managing Authority, Governance Type, the enabling legislation, and note this one, subsurface right status. So again, all of these speak to the governance or the protective mechanism that's in place. Some of them are a little bit confusing. I'm going to talk about them in a second. And then there's a single field that speaks to biodiversity, and it's the biome. Now, note that some of those zones might actually be based on ecological criteria. That's up to the entity that has created that protection mechanism, that protected area, whether or not they want to do that. But sometimes that comes in here as well. Okay, so just a little bit of clarity. The zone, if it's identified into zones, they're identified separately. Biome splits only into 2 possible answers. You either say it's marine or it's terrestrial freshwater. So we really don't get a lot of ecological information from that. The reporting jurisdiction number, you're either from a province or a territorial government or one of these agencies, and that's it. The reporting jurisdictions are limited to that. IT Target 11 and Canada Target 1 basically does the protected or conserved area get to be counted towards Target 11, Target 1 or not? IUCN Management Category, this is a little bit of a tricky one. It really only applies to protected areas. It's never been intended to be applied to conserved areas, the OECMs. But the CPCAD user manual suggests that this is the level of protection for biodiversity. And I'm flagging this because it's really important. That's not true. The IUCN is really, really clear that those management categories, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, ecological reserve, national park, all of those, they're really clear. This is not intended to be a hierarchy of what's good or bad, what's better or not, what's more natural, less natural. It's saying these are the different kinds and all of them need to be used, and some are more appropriate in other circumstances than others. So it's really important not to get stuck on that hierarchical perspective. The OECM or other effective area-based conservation measure, that's just a yes, no. The type designation, so the designation type of a protected or conserved area is the note might be included in the name. So you might be saying Banff National Park, then the type designation would be National Park, but it's up to each jurisdiction to come up with its own permissible values. The managing authority is the agency, the organization, individual group that actually manages this protected area. The governance type is the decision-making structure of a protected or other conserved area. And this is something that comes again from all of the IUCN documentation and direction. But in here, the options are national government, subnational, government delegated, transboundary, collaborative, joint, individual landowners, nonprofit organizations, for-profit, Indigenous peoples, local communities. So it really spans the whole range of governance types. But the next one kind of flies in the face of that. It says the enabling legislation. So the official name of the current legislation or other binding document. But this is awkward because the enabling mechanism may not be a gazetted park law. If the governance mechanism is entirely different from that normal structure, these kinds of things don't work as well. There needs to be a much wider variety of possibilities here. Status is just, is it designated? Is it established by an NGO or private? So designated and established are apparently very different things. Established interim, meaning we haven't said yes to you yet, but you can come and wait in the waiting room for a bit. Proposed and delisted if it's been removed. Ownership, again, sometimes the management agency is different from who owns it. So who's the entity that actually owns it. This last one's really interesting. Subsurface right status. It's the only one that gets added very specifically into the database that reflects a concern or a general dilemma around land use. And so this indicates the agencies, organizations who might hold the subsurface rights. So that's oil and gas, that's mining rights. But in terms of the acceptable answers, it's really a mix of status and owner. So extinguished is one possible answer, but federal crown is another possible answer, or withdrawn by the province. So it hasn't really been thought through all that carefully, but there's a real anxiety about subsurface rights with the screening committee. And so this got tacked on as something that needed to be cataloged. So speaking of that screening committee, what they created was a decision support tool to help people understand how you would actually assess whether or not your protected or conserved area that you're suggesting should be in the database, how do you make that decision? So the decision support tool, and by the way, I have links at the end here for all of these documents if you want to go and take a look at them in detail, because this wasn't painful enough to go through all of the detail here. So the decision support tool, the screening tool, it's intended to facilitate the inclusion of projects into CPCAD, but it really focuses heavily on distinguishing between a protected area and an OECM. That's a really, for some reason, fundamentally important question that has to be answered before it's included in the CPCAD database. Also assesses whether or not an area is worthy. And I use that very vague and somewhat pejorative term because that's sort of how the evaluation seems to work out sometimes, is that it's a very broad question of worthiness, and it's not exactly clear how that decision is finally and fundamentally made. Okay, so in this decision support tool, again, I'm not giving you all of the details here, but what they do is they identify a number of criteria, which are again drawn directly from IUCN guidance on protected areas and on OECM, so it's a great start. And then they say the intended effect of each one of those criteria. So you understand what was supposed to happen here. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but I wanted to flag a couple of issues with some of these. So for example, geographical space. It's supposed to demarcate the area to facilitate in situ conservation of biodiversity. But the IUCN intention initially was just to make sure that it was demarcated and agreed upon, that it's an area-based measure. So it's not something like restrictions on harvest or those kinds of mechanisms. It might have a conservation aspect for sure, but they're not area-based. And in the protective area standard for the screening tool, it says the geographical space is clearly defined and agreed upon borders. There's nothing about in situ conservation, but in the OECM ones there is. Effective is a really challenging one. In fact, there's two effective categories in the screening tool, but essentially it's that the activities that are incompatible with in situ conservation of biodiversity do not occur, and compatible activities are effectively managed. So the challenge here is that there's a huge focus on the mechanism. So it's the criteria that you're given to understand whether or not you meet this criterion is the mechanism provides the ability to prevent incompatible activities and manage all other activities such that the in situ conservation of biodiversity can be achieved. And then also that the mechanism compels the authority to prohibit activities. And so there's no measure of whether those prohibitions actually will lead to biodiversity conservation, just to focus on the mechanism. And I think there really needs to be a separation. You assess the mechanism, the protective mechanism, does it have teeth, versus the management regime. is a governing authority protecting biodiversity, but we get kind of a mix in here. The long-term one should be really straightforward, but it's one of the places where some of the misconceptions and frankly some slights about private land conservation show up. So the area is permanently protected or conserved, and the mechanism is not easily reversed. So the description, so there'll be the descriptions within the table, but then there's all of this guiding information in the support tool as well, as would be appropriate. But it uses things like odd examples, like you might need a 999-year conservation easement. Well, that's not how easements are generally framed. They're framed as perpetual. It's a different kind of way of looking at it than maybe what their perspective of contract law would be. It questions the track record of NGOs, but doesn't question the track record of provincial park agencies, which I think we're all aware are under scrutiny right now. And then it says things like, it's understood that there are instances where non-government entities may lack mechanisms for conservation and perpetuity. Well, A, generally not true, but B, no more so than everywhere else. I think the big challenge is that there's this perspective that something can be quote unquote permanently protected, like a forever protection, but we constantly have boundary changes to provincial parks, delisting of provincial parks, and in Alberta, our disposition regulation basically allows the minister unlimited disposition possibilities within parks. So, and I'm not saying that that means parks are bad and we shouldn't be including them. It's just that we're holding one type of protection to one standard and one type to another standard. The timing doesn't really have any issues. It just speaks to the fact that you shouldn't just protect it for a certain portion of the year. It should be all year round. Objectives, another area within the decision support tool is a little bit challenging. It's first of all, directed the primacy of objectives, which makes sense. Objectives are such that they result in the in situ conservation of biodiversity. You have to measure that to see whether or not you're actually getting that outcome. But this is one of the challenges that shows up a lot. It blends the criteria. So there's governance criteria in here, management criteria here, long-term criteria, and it doesn't really just speak to, is it primary, great, yes, no. And because of that, the next one, the scope of objectives, becomes a little bit redundant. So if the intent of the first criteria is to ensure that they're in place, then all of the clarifying information in the screening tool really becomes challenging to understand, because you're sort of left to think, well, didn't we already answer that question? Governing authorities, the in situ conservation of biodiversity is not jeopardized by the relevant governing authorities. This one was really fascinating because the IUCN intent, when they talk about governing authorities, is to ensure that the area is actively governed. And there's all of these different options that I mentioned before. But when you start talking about jeopardized by governing authorities, that's really different and suggests a very different perspective. Like, you should start off by being afraid of the governing entity. And again, this one in their direction bleeds into a whole bunch of other criteria, and again has misconceptions about the security of private land conservation, includes these convoluted examples about how private land might be unsecure, but doesn't include convoluted examples for other types of management regimes. Biodiversity conservation outcomes is the last one. It says biodiversity is conserved in situ, and it's, again, has some challenges in that the management intent and the biodiversity outcomes are kind of mixed together. So it says the area is being managed with the intent of and is likely achieving the conservation objectives, but a management effectiveness consideration isn't a biodiversity outcome measure. And screening tools like this really can only measure sort of the intent and the status. What does it seem from the management goals and objectives and plans is the intent, and what's the current biodiversity status, not the outcomes of these yet to be applied practices. So it's, again, a little bit challenging to figure out when you're trying to run your protected area through this. And I think it's important to point out, at no point is there any assessment of the current biodiversity status. That doesn't really matter when you're trying to get into the tool or into the database through this decision support tool. It's all about the mechanism, not about biodiversity. So again, some of the bigger issues are it deviates from the IUCN guidance and often opportunistically. It equates this protective mechanism. If it's a park, then therefore biodiversity will be conserved, which I think we all know is not the case, or not always the case. It hangs all of the criteria on this in situ conservation of biodiversity, but gives only a really vague definition, which is unfortunate because this comes from conventional biological diversity, and through the IUCN, there's a lot of really good direction on exactly what that means that could be used. Constant intermixing of the criteria, it's structured to operate as this gatekeeper to keep unworthy out, as opposed to being the facilitator to try and make sure that we appropriately increase the number of hectares that are conserved. The screening is intended for pieces, an individual protected area, but a lot of the criteria talk about the system and whole biodiversity and biodiversity as a whole. And so you're trying to judge whether or not your protected area is conserving all of biodiversity, but that's not actually supposed to be the goal of that one piece. It's supposed to fit within a system, but there isn't really that mechanism for doing that. And similarly, the assessment is for this theoretical ideal as opposed to furtherance of conservation. So there will be direction that says, again, this species needs the whole system, which is true, but that doesn't help me identify whether or not my area will fit in. I need to be able to assess it to say this area provides an important piece of that system. The decision support tool information doesn't correlate with the CPCAD fields. And I think that's a real challenge, but a missed opportunity as well. It means that when you go and query the database, all of this information that you have collected here, good or bad, isn't included there. It's just the CPCAD fields. So trying to get information on what was conserved and how, in what ways and what tools were used, and all of the governance mechanisms, none of that is captured in the same detail as the screening tool does. I think right back to the beginning of my presentation, the way the end game was framed as management, not biodiversity, by the way we changed our goals in Canada, I think that happens here in the way the decision support tool is created. I think for private land conservation, the major issue is you can't see private land conservation tools here. It's very difficult to try and wedge that in. And again, selective in terms of incompatible activities. We've got a whole section on subsurface rights, but we all know that recreation is a major problem for maintaining biodiversity in a lot of different areas. Nothing about that. Who evaluates is really unclear. So it appears to be the expert task team, but it's not actually stated. And so you end up sending this to your protected areas agency in the province that you come from and not really sure whether or not that is the person who makes the final call or not. And it's really clear, the World Database on Protected Areas says that if it's information submitted by non-government sources, the data can be verified by the state verifiers or by experts, depending on the wishes of the data provider. But there's no option in CPCAD for a land trust to choose expert verifiers versus provincial verifiers. Okay, so what are some of the challenges that this creates overall? I think one of the big challenges is that there's a bias to publicly protected areas. And again, not to say because those are bad and that's wrong, just it makes it challenging for other kinds of approaches. So the current efforts to measure biodiversity protection use that sort of traditional protected area lens. The pathway experts assume the use of public protected area tools. So we don't have anybody there with private land conservation expertise. The CCA, Canadian Council on Ecological Area, their database derived for something before, which didn't include really a broad consideration of conserved areas, has just been rolled forward. And private protected areas use the same IUCN criteria, but often the way that this is looked at is, oh, if it's private, then it must be an OECM, and we won't even think about putting it forward for considerations of protected area. The database is aimed at the pathway process, but it doesn't necessarily help other initiatives. So like, for example, this heavy emphasis on, is it a protected area in OECM? Most conservation programs wouldn't care. We're just trying to figure out if it's going to be conserving biodiversity. And the pathway screening tool and the database were really rushed. So there was a lot of work that was done to try and improve it, but then it was, oh, we just got to get this done. So we went back to the old structure. Probably the most significant challenge is the lack of inclusion in the process. So the province has taken over the jurisdictional role for private land conservation. No consultation with land trusts and conservancies about that. The federal government, the provincial territorial governments, Indigenous groups are all represented in expert task teams, but not private land conservation experts. And again, the World Database on Protected Areas is really clear that the data holder should be dictating who reports, but Pathway ignores that in the case of private land conservation. The private land conservation tools are really poorly understood. So there's this sort of broad assumption that if it's a gazetted park, that status is superior to NGO ownership. So you really have to make the NGO ownership possibility prove itself to a higher degree. Conservation easements aren't automatically included because they look so different from parks. So we get situations where something that looks like that picture on the bottom right is immediately included because it says national park, but this is a large conservation easement on a for-profit industrial operation, a ranch. And so it doesn't get included. Doesn't get included immediately. There's a lot more hoops and jumps that it has to go through. And in fairness, one of the big challenges is the land trust community. The land trust community, the land trust and conservancy community, is relatively small. Most groups have low capacity. They're scattered across the country. It creates this fragmentation. So there's no collective voice on policy issues, despite a number of groups having tried to do that. And so what happens is large national groups drive the government agendas because governments go and talk to them. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't work because obviously when it's specific to one organization, whoever that organization is, you end up having a lack of diversity in the approach. I noted this before, the subsurface rights one is really problematic, and for me, in the sense that it's the only issue that gets this special attention. And so recreation, parks dispositions, all of that kind of stuff is just assumed that it's underneath, yeah, we'll cover that with objectives and management effectiveness, but we have to pull this out specifically for subsurface rights. But even in doing that, there's no real robust consideration of that. Like, what's the difference between potential and actual impacts? And how do these concepts of likelihood or intent get reflected in these assessments? Because it's not the case that you should just allow subsurface rights, obviously, but having flagged it, there's no, like I said, real robust way of dealing with that. Data deficiencies are huge. We've got this collective understanding of private land conservation that is like the contribution of private land conservation to biodiversity. Collectively, our understanding is very poor. And in Alberta, our data is very poor. And when I say poor, I don't mean that we don't have good quality data in places of high resolution and all of that. It's that it's fragmented, it's inaccessible, and most importantly, it's unavailable for planning. So these kinds of initiatives have a lot of trouble trying to gather that information. But we know that CPCAT is missing a significant amount of private land conservation data. So Lisa McLaughlin at the Nature Conservancy of Canada's head office put together this information for a presentation that she and I did at the Parks Conference in Quebec a couple of years ago now. CPCAT has about 487,000 hectares of privately conserved land. We know that that's significantly underrepresented. It only counts land trusts and some private landowners, so we've missed universities, and we've missed for-profit entities that have conserved lands that might count as an OECM. And of the more than 100 land trusts around the country, only 10 of them even have any information showing in the database. And of those land trusts, only a small portion of their lands are counted. So Lisa put together this information and said, you know, this is what we're currently seeing as public, and what we're seeing as private, a very small amount. But if we were to look at just the Nature Conservancy and just Ducks Unlimited by province, if we could add all of the land that they're conserving, we would be adding tens of thousands of hectares to the Canadian Protected and Conserved Areas database. So what are some of the potential solutions? I think one of the key things is we need to reframe jurisdiction. We need to persuade the National Steering Committee of the pathway process that jurisdictions must be considered as those with the sites under their administrative control. And land trusts are the holders of data. They are the administrators of lands that they own, and they are co-administrators of the lands that have easements on them. The World Database on Protected Areas says that the data holder chooses if it's a state or the expert reviewer who evaluates it. And land trusts need to push that back and say, we're going to have a voice in how this is assessed. And neither federal nor provincial government lands have administrative jurisdiction over private land. Just because it's within their jurisdiction, sort of like saying, well, Banff National Park is within Alberta, so therefore the province of Alberta should be reporting on Banff. I don't think Parks Canada Agency would be so keen on that. We need to expand the decision support tool, that screening tool, for private land. So provide more explicit direction for private landowners, have private land conservation experts provide input into the data schema, and consider how to manage the capacity limitations on the side of these private land conservation jurisdictions, landowners. There is a real significant challenge there with the ability of those organizations to provide that information. So one of the things that the Canadian Land Trust Working Group asked Miistakis to create was a private land conservation and pathway alignment guide. So start with the tools we use, conservation easements, fee simple purchase, and tell us how that meshes with the guidance that comes from Pathway. So we use Pathway, IUCN, the step-by-step guidance regarding protected areas, private protected areas, OECM's conserved areas, and then also included some guidance for, again, how you deal with these contentious issues from the perspective of a land trust, from the perspective of the agreements that you use, the tools you have, the policies that you might be creating. Another one would be the private land conservation database. Like, one of the challenges we have is no one knows the total private conserved acres and details of that in the province. So Pathway catalyzed a number of efforts. So the Land Use Secretariat of the provinces has been off and on trying to work at that. The Land Stewardship Centre of Canada in Edmonton has been working to expand their data, conservation easement registry. Miistakis has a proposal to create a database. The EcoGIFts program has a database. There are these initiatives and efforts, but we need to coalesce them basically. And we need for the reporting on path, we need these databases for the reporting on Pathway, but it can't be just narrowly for that program. We need this information more broadly for municipal planning, for the regional planning, biodiversity management frameworks, the land trust planning that's done individually. So it's a broader need. And I think at the end of this, we need collective action on the part of land trusts and have that nationally. Right now, each province's land trusts are being approached individually. And, you know, kudos to the Canadian Land Trust Working Group, and huge kudos to Lisa McLaughlin at the Nature Conservancy. They've been at the forefront, banging on the door to get included. In fact, a lot of this wouldn't exist without Lisa, but we need more, and we need more collective and coordinated effort. And we need to have that private land conservation voice and expertise right up at the National Steering Committee level. This is a jurisdiction. This is a whole nother jurisdiction that's really not being considered. Okay, I'm going to leave you with one final thought here. The next 100 years. So when we think about the next 100 years, we know that we're going to have a more complex land use matrix. That means increasingly the landscapes that we look at are going to be characterized by working landscapes, increasingly characterized by urbanized landscapes, co-managing different aspects of these landscapes, and probably most importantly, they're going to be increasingly heavily populated. We know that, and by orders of magnitude. That means that our ecological conservation needs have to be equally more complex. So we're already doing this to some degree, you know, moving from just looking at the pieces to looking at the entire ecological system, making sure that we consider connectivity, ecological isolates, the different functional components of that entire system, not just the big wide pieces. And climate is affecting everything. These systems are climate affected. We need to be thinking about climate refugia. We need to be thinking about climate migration routes. Different kinds of complexities over the next 100 years need to be brought in here. And the systems are going to change fundamentally. Novel and emerging ecosystems are becoming increasingly important for us to consider. And that means that our tendency to base things on the natural range of variation is an increasingly more and more wobbly base for that. So our approach has to be more complex. Like, if you look at that top left corner, visionaries like Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir, who were 100 years ago saying, look, we need to draw lines around these untouched areas. And not a lot of people were thinking that, and very few were able to do it. And they stepped forward and said, we're going to do this. Conservation of the next 100 years is going to need an equal level of visionary people. But it's going to look different. It's not going to be the same kinds of things, not a replacement, an addition to. It means sometimes we're going to be looking right down to the microbiotic level. Sometimes we're going to be looking at heavily human influenced landscapes that we want to protect. It means we're going to be looking at ecological processes across an entire landscape, a whole landscape across all of these different uses, and not just in areas that are protected or quote unquote protected. And I think fundamentally we have to recognize that all of this implies we have to expand our conservation approaches, not replace them. This is not a parks and protected areas versus private land conservation, or a public versus private, a federal versus provincial. This is about additive. This is about all of them coming online, and it's not an either or prospect. And so all of our initiatives towards this have to look at how we integrate these different perspectives. So that's the message I wanted to leave with you at the end here. I did mention that I would give you these resources. The Pathway to Canada Target 1, all of their documents are there, and specifically their accounting tools are there. This is the link to that Aligning Privately Conserved Areas to Pathway to Target 1 that I mentioned that Miistakis created for the Canadian Land Trust Working Group. And probably most important is the information from this webinar gets posted on our webinars page. So that means you get the slide deck is posted there as a PDF, and you get the recording of the webinar will be posted up there as a YouTube video. So with that, I'm going to thank you all for listening. Again, we've got a little bit of time for questions. I'll note that if your question doesn't get answered, please feel free to email me or jot down my phone number for future use after we are social distancing. Right now, there's no one in the Miistakis office, but that email will get your information to me. So I'm just gonna scan through what's already gone up. It looks like there was just one question. I think I answered that question on the way. Were Indigenous folks included all along the way? Yes. The Indigenous Circle of Experts sat side by side with the National Steering Committee. They created the We Rise Together strategy, and they're currently working through the details of how Indigenous protected and conserved areas are included. So in a lot of cases, there's these placeholders where it says, you know, at some point, once the IPCA group has figured this out, this is where this information will be included. Another question, can you provide a bit more background on how they came up with the 17%? I think that there's a couple of ways to answer that question. Like the 12% target from, what was that, 1988, I think. What we start off doing in these targets is generally try and look at what is the area that we have heavily disturbed on the planet, and let's at least make sure that we have that amount of area that is strictly protected for biodiversity conservation. We throw good chunks of science in there in terms of trying to come up with a number that would also facilitate representativity, facilitate some connectivity, all of those kinds of things. But it is a relatively, I called it an arbitrary number, that's probably unfair, but it is a relatively round number that's intended to sort of catalyze activity. Is there continuous reassessment for subsurface rights? Yeah, definitely not. This is one of the things, I deleted a slide on this, just the whole change in use. And I think this is one of the things that is also part and parcel of a private land conservation perspective is things are constantly changing. Management regimes change, management standards change, best practices or beneficial practices, new information comes in. We're trying to figure out how to maintain the system while all of those things are changing in the background. And so there's a lot of argument about, well, if there's a potential that it's going to change, it shouldn't even be included in the database because this is only the stuff that we know is permanently protected forever and ever, amen. And I think that that's a slightly facile perspective on the way lands, even in our traditional protected areas, actually function or change. So that's one of the questions that needs to be dealt with is if you're looking at the risk associated with subsurface, you have to be looking at how that risk might change and how you would do the reassessment. Do you have any additional information about the upcoming 25% target? Like I mentioned very briefly, the National Steering Committee right now is doing a strategic assessment. Exactly what that will involve, I don't know, but it's their recognition that this is a little bit different from the 17% target that was based on already having 11 or so percent or 10%. And now we're looking at a very, very big change and a very different kind of process forward. So I think we can look to the National Steering Committee to be coming up with information from that assessment and hopefully more information on exactly your question. Is there a movement to create a national land trust alliance as in the US that represents land trust collective interests? Yes, so there's a couple of different things that exist. So Canada had a Canadian Land Trust Alliance for some time. They were instrumental in creating the Canadian Land Trust Standards and Practices, which is an excellent set of documents that many land trusts across the country adhere to in developing their policies and practices. In the last little while, they have become less active. The Canadian Land Trust Working Group that I mentioned is more an ad hoc group. They come together for specific issues to try and address those. So not a standing body, but trying to address some of those things. And there's a new entity that's being created by a few people, including some lawyers and federal government participants, Nature Conservancy in Ontario, looking at creating a, I've forgotten the name momentarily, Canada Lands entity, also looking at trying to incorporate aspects like certification and consistency of messaging, but it's challenging, no question. But there's a lot of work trying to do that. My permaculture buddies would qualify, but the paperwork and uncertain criteria would scare them to death. You know, this is a really good point. I try and make the case sometimes that we're guarding the door to a party that a lot of people don't actually want to come and be part of. And so we're assuming that it's a big party and we're going to have too many people come in. But when we're looking at private land conservation, forest companies, permaculture buddies, all of these people are not really motivated to come and play in the sandbox with a navel-gazing accounting exercise, which is the way they might perceive it. So there has to be a really different perspective on this, that there has to be encouragement and facilitation and ease. Where or who are the obstacles at the NSC level to keep private lands out? What is timing to influence their decisions? Good question. I think one of the obstacles is structural. So this all came from the Canadian Council on Ecological Areas being protected areas managers. Then the National Steering Committee was set up from the jurisdictions, federal, provincial, territorial jurisdictions, again, protected areas managers. The municipal folks have been trying this as well, trying to make representations to that group. I think that the way to do it, to answer this question directly, is probably through our own province, is to say, because again, it's a voluntary thing and every jurisdiction is at the same level, is to say, look, province of Alberta, you are doing a great job in so much as you can with this, but you don't have the expertise and you don't have the authority. We would like to sit side by side with you. I think the second part of that is if there's a single province's land trusts or a single group of land trusts making that argument, it's harder than if there's some sort of collective action, which goes back to the questions about, is there somebody who's integrating? That's a very short answer to a much longer consideration. I'd be interested in learning more about the 80,000 hectares in Alberta conserved by Nature Conservancy and Ducks Unlimited, and what kinds of range of allowable activities there are on those lands. Brackets, but I understand you may not have these details. I don't, but Lisa McLaughlin at the Nature Conservancy's national office is the one who put those numbers together, and she would be able to answer those questions more directly. So if you send me an email, I will connect you with Lisa and she can answer that question for you. I think I've gotten through all, I've skipped in a very cursory way through all of those questions and given you partial and unsatisfying answers to everything that you've asked. But like I said, my contact information is there. I'd be more than happy to answer some of these things in more detail if that's what people are looking for. I think we'll pause just a minute to see if there's any other last questions in our last 2 minutes. But again, I'll back up and point you to the webinar page and just say, again, all of this information will be collected on the webinar page, and you can get the slide deck and the recording, and you can pass the links around to people who weren't able. Looks like we'll have one last question. I remember papers in the Alberta Conservation Strategy years ago, the 80s, talking about islands of protection. This addresses the points you had about protected areas versus whole landscapes. Yeah, I think that reflects exactly the kinds of evolution. Like that was when we first started talking about cores and pathways, cores and connectivity, and started having those conversations about single large versus several small in terms of conservation biology and landscape ecology discussions. And then we sort of moved to making sure that we have big intact, and then we started to recognize the value of these ecological isolates. So we're getting more and more evolution of our understanding of what's needed for an ecological system to be maintained. And a lot of it does go back to some of those base principles that were identified by folks like Reed Noss and Alan Cooper Ryder and those guys back then. Okay, I will leave it at that. Thank you all very much for taking the time to be part of the webinar. And like I said, I'll be happy to answer any of the questions that you might have. And on that webinar page, there's also the list of the upcoming webinars, so you can join from there. We'll be posting the link for the Zoom webinars on that webinar page, so you can go directly there in future to connect to the webinars. So again, thanks all very much.